Hello and welcome to the UK column. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Andrew Bridgen. Welcome to the programme, Andrew.
It's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you. And well, the election has begun and already it seems to be a bit of a clown show. So the question that we could start off with is, what is the situation with MPs at the moment? How are they feeling about this election? Why have we seen so many of them resigning? Or effectively not standing again. And the people that are replacing them, are they in any way qualified?
Yeah, well, these are big questions. I mean, why are we having the election? Rishi Sunak does not want to be a wartime leader. He's got us into escalation in the conflict in Ukraine. We're now in a situation where we've got British personnel firing British missiles out of Ukraine into Russia. And so have the Americans, the Poles, the Germans, and everyone else. But they're just not squaring that and telling the people. Inflation's down to 2.3% allegedly. I'm not sure anyone renewing their mortgage at the moment would think that that's the inflation rate. Rishi Sunak claims his economic plan's working. Well, if it really was working, surely he'd wait longer and prove that it's working in the autumn. The fact is he knows, and so does everyone else, but they're not talking about it, that food price inflation is going to skyrocket before the end of the summer. So this is as good as it gets. So I don't believe there'll be any interest rate cuts. We're still 0.3% above the Bank of England's target, and I think it's going to rise again as the year progresses. So that's another reason. And the third reason is the Rwanda policy was only ever showboating. The legislation's not going to work unless we're out of the European Convention of Human Rights and the agreement on refugees, which I told and many other experienced members of the House told Rishi Sunak 18 months ago. This is not going to fly. All it'll be is an earnings fest for the lawyers. You and I have got more chance of going to Rwanda than any illegal migrants. So that will be apparent by November that it's not working, and it never was going to work. So that's another reason he needs to go. And another reason is that the COVID-19 safe and effective narrative has been destroyed. Increasing numbers of people realise now that they've been misled seriously by both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and he needs to bail out. And what we're going to end up with is a lot of new MPs who will vote with the whip. What we're seeing, this is not what the media would paint it as, a race to the election finish line between the blue and the red team. This is a relay race. They're both wings of the same bird, and it's a baton handover. And it's almost as if Sunak realises that Starmer is lamentably bad, and so he's got to do everything he can to destroy the Conservative Party to get Starmer across the line. I think Tory MPs will be pulling their hair out at the gaffes that have been made during this election campaign. It's difficult to believe that no one thought that pulling out of the D-Day commemorations was in any way appropriate at any time, let alone during an election campaign. And it's clown world, quite honestly.
Yes, so that was something I was going to ask you because, we look at what's happened in this election so far. First of all, we had a week and a half of whether Labour was going to allow Diane Abbott to stand or not. And then we've had several days of the D-Day. And in the meantime, nobody's talking about proper issues. And so is the running of this election just going to be completely diversionary? And I noticed that the first item on your list there was Ukraine. And I'm not hearing too much discussion about defense and war and the path that these people have brought us on.
If you look at the facts, I mean, they've been ramping up our involvement in this, telling us that Ukraine's winning, but having to send more and more sophisticated weaponry, which requires NATO personnel to operate that and maintain it. None of the facts stack up. They talk about conscription. They talk about national service, preparing us for a major conflict. At the same time as they've just shut the last steelworks in the UK that can make weapons-grade steel, and they're taking land out of food production for environmental reasons. None of this stacks up. I will tell your viewers that France and Germany have already created the enabling legislation. They can enact conscription tomorrow if they want to. We haven't got that far in the UK. I think, the spineless prime minister that we've had in Rishi Sunak, who appears to have no loyalty to the country, the people, or indeed the Conservative Party that he was leading. I think he's just leaving it all to Starmer. And also, it was very telling that the last week before Sunak panicked and called the snap election, we had an urgent question on the WHO. Not one Labour backbencher attended that urgent question. That must be because they were whipped. I've never known that ever happened before. And it's clear from the front bench statements the Labour Party are making that they're going to sign us up to whatever instrument we end up with from the WHO, taking away UK sovereignty and giving it to an unelected, unaccountable, non-tax-paying and diplomatically immune from prosecution organisation where the Director General has ultimate power, who was placed in his position by an unholy alliance of Bill Gates and the Chinese Communist Party. I can't think what could possibly go wrong for the British people.
I'd like to talk a little bit about mood. So let's, first of all, the mood amongst the people that are standing in the mainstream parties at the moment. Let's talk about that first, because is there any energy in them? Is there any enthusiasm for this election? Are they actually excited at the prospect of serving another term?
I don't think there's any excitement from Conservative MPs. They didn't want the snap election. They didn't expect it. Labour didn't expect it. It's come as a bit of a shock. But if Sunak had waited another 3 weeks, he only had 3 weeks to call it, because you can't really call it during the summer recess. And July the 4th is only 22 days before summer recess starts on the parliamentary calendar. Then he'd have to wait until at least September to call it, and it'd be an October election. And he knew that by then the cat would be out the bag on the vaccine harms excess deaths and the disastrous Rwanda policy. And clearly as well, with the continued escalation in Ukraine, we could well be further embroiled in that. And he just wants out. He's a very wealthy man. I'm sure his hedge fund has made its positions has adopted its positions for a war. And as you know, war, it feeds the super rich and it buries the poor.
Yes, indeed. And so then the other question about mood is, what is the mood amongst the electorate? Now, obviously, you're spending your time in Northwest Leicestershire at the moment. What are people talking about? Are people engaged on the issues that you've listed at the moment, or are they living in mostly the world of mainstream politics?
Increasingly, people are aware. I've been out already this morning for a couple of hours delivering leaflets and speaking to local people. It's whether enough people have woken up. It's clear in Northwest Leicestershire that the Conservatives, the campaign's failed. Some would say it's been torpedoed by their leader, Rishi Sunak. So in Northwest Leicestershire, it's between me and the Labour Party. It's disappointing that Reform decided to stand a candidate in my constituency. That is a distraction and says more about Reform than it does about me or Northwest Leicestershire. But I think it's definitely between myself now and the Labour Party. This is my fifth general election, and I've beaten the Labour Party 4 times already. For the good of the country and for my constituents, I need to do it again. It's just harder as an independent. There's just obviously the party infrastructure does help with the leaflets and everything else. And when you've got to do that and manage the ground campaign, and of course I've got no air campaign. I'm cancelled by the mainstream media since I spoke out and stopped the government from vaccinating the small babies in December 2022. The BBC did contact me this week, the local radio. They gave me a slot of 15 seconds to explain why people should vote for me. That's after serving the people of Northwest Leicestershire and fighting for them for over 14 years as an MP. That's about 1 second a year they give me.
That's better than Brian got when he stood in 2010, because he got 6 seconds from BBC local radio to do the same. And the next question then, because the other experience that we had at that time was that he, standing as an independent, was not allowed to take part in the hustings. What are your expectations there?
We've already got one hustings organised for the 19th. I'm looking forward to that. As the incumbent, I am invited. But I'm doing public meetings several times a week, and different events I'm speaking at in the constituency. Obviously, the mainstream parties candidates, the Labour and the Conservative Party candidates, are not keen to have a hustings with me, where their deficiencies will be exposed to the public. So they're really not very keen on doing public hustings.
Public meetings, these are good, but of course, people that go to those are people that are interested in you and what you have to say anyway, whereas the hustings, you at least get to interact with your supposed opponents anyway. So if you're excluded from that, it always seemed to be absolutely undemocratic to me that certain people get more airtime on mainstream media, certain people get the right to speak on the stage at hustings. People that are standing as independents are excluded. Surely everybody should have an equal voice, and then anybody who's standing that maybe isn't qualified is exposed as such.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what should happen. But I mean, the whole of the media organisation is to maximise the effect of the party system. And as we know, the party system is eminently controllable and corruptible, and that's what's happened. And it's not just happened in our so-called democracy in the UK. We've seen democracy usurped around the Western world. They're all in lockstep. I did early this morning. I did an interview with Liz Gunn in New Zealand. They've got exactly the same problems with their parliament. They've had a change of government there, but the fundamental policies are still Agenda 2030, and it's just quietly moving on. It doesn't matter. Well, I think somebody said once, didn't it? If voting changed anything, they wouldn't let you do it. That's why they exclude the independents, because we're not controllable. I think I'm saying now to people on the doorsteps, I believe you can either have an MP who represents a party in North West Leicestershire, or you can have an MP who represents North West Leicestershire in Parliament, but you can't have both, because the whipping from the parties and the candidate selection is so tight. And after 13 years as a Conservative MP and working for the people of North West Leicestershire, when I spoke out on the vaccines, I was thrown out of the party because that wasn't the party line. But I mean, I committed to do what I thought was for the best for my constituents and the country, and I stand by that decision.
Andrew, what do you say to people? Because there must be a lot of people that will be watching this, and there must be a lot of people in the country anyway that are so disillusioned with politics and mainstream politics that they are not going to take any part in this election at all. And it seems to me that, not taking part, that might be some kind of protest, but actually we're much more likely to end up with what we've always had if people don't take part. But I mean, what's your message to those people?
Well, one of the reasons he's called the election early is he could see that there was opposition to the mainstream parties, and he didn't want to give any organisation the ability to mobilise. Quite honestly, I would ask anyone who's got the ability to come to North West Leicestershire and help my campaign to come and do it. We'd be very, very welcome. We've got lots of postal vote letters to get out in the next week and more leaflets to push through doors. And you can contact us at contact@abridgen.uk.
I'll just push a little bit harder on this because the disillusionment and the
You've got to vote for independent candidates. Quite honestly, where you can, where they're standing, vote for people who are from the local community, who will represent the local community, not those who will represent a party. And this is all demonstrated by the fact that candidates for the main parties have been campaigning for weeks and may have been in position for months. And their manifestos are going to be announced this week, which is something which they've had no input on. So they're campaigning for something which they don't know what it is. and they're tied to that manifesto, regardless of what's in it. It's absolutely ludicrous, and they'll be whipped by their newly elected MPs arriving in Westminster. There's going to be a massive influx, whatever happens, given the number of resignations. A massive influx of new MPs. I mean, it'll take them 18 months, 2 years to find out where to hang their coat, let alone the way parliamentary procedure works. And we're on the brink of a third world war. We're being threatened with lockdowns and vaccinations with a possible avian flu scamdemic again. There are many threats on the horizon, and I don't think there's going to be enough experienced voices with the courage to stand up and actually represent the people. And where we are now is the people of this country, they seem to think that politicians are the masters. We're not. We're the servants of the people. That's what we're supposed to be. We're in a situation now where the people are worried what their parliament is going to inflict upon them next. And when the people are scared of the politicians, that's tyranny. And that's where we are now. From net zero through to the COVID disastrous lockdowns and those policies, which have never been properly debated and exposed for the damage they've done to our economy and our society. We're in a situation now where there's been a slight improvement. We've only got 900,000 under 25s waiting for mental health support. We did have 1 million straight after the lockdowns. These things must never happen again, and we won't have experienced voices in that House of Commons to represent the real wishes of the people, because those newly elected MPs are going to vote whichever way the whips tell them, and that's what they want. They want lobby fodder. I want to get back into Parliament and stand up there and try and be a voice for the people, a voice of reason in very difficult times.
And that's the real danger, because inexperienced MPs, as you say, it's going to take them 2 years to get their feet under the desk, as it were. They haven't a clue how any of it works. They're going to have the wool pulled over their eyes at every turn.
And the Whip's office don't tell you the powers you have to create requests for debates, because they don't want you doing that. They'll tell you what they want you to do. I can always remember, I'll share with you, the first time I voted against the government, my party, back in, I think it was 2011, 2010. And it was obviously for demanding a referendum on our membership of the European Union. And I can remember that following that, on a Saturday morning when I was at home, I took a phone call in the days when we used to have wired-in phones. And some little oik on the end of the phone said, "Stand by to take a call from the Chief Whip." And so I don't know if he thought I was going to put my heels together. And so I waited for Patrick McLaughlin, the then Chief Whip, to come on the phone. And he started effing and blinding at me on the phone without me saying anything, telling me that my job was to vote with the government. That's what I was elected. I got to vote with the government. That's all I had to do. Don't think about it. Just vote with the government. And he was swearing at me. And when he stopped talking, I said, "Patrick, please don't ever ring me at home on a Saturday and swear at me on the phone, for two reasons." I said, "First of all, you're not going to change my mind. I'm voting for a referendum on the European Union. So don't change. I'm not going to change my mind, whatever you say. So you're wasting your time doing it. And B, never, ever, ever pretend to me that you're a grizzly bear when I know you're only a teddy bear." The phone went quiet. He put the phone down on me, and he never rang me again about my voting record the rest of my career.
Yeah. Okay, good. Now, sticking with independence, because we have coined this term Independence Day, which hopefully is going to get lots of traction. But anyway, how many MPs were there that were genuinely independent in the last Parliament?
Very, very few. Not 2% of the Parliament, and obviously it's very difficult for a newly elected MP to ever vote against the whip. It's not what they want to do. It's not what the mandate that they've got. It takes them time to realise that their duty is actually to the people who elected them. It's not to any colour of any rosette. Right. And there isn't really much difference between the colours of the rosette.
Right, indeed. So if that was to change, if it wasn't even 2%, if that was to change to 10% or 20%, What difference would that actually make, and how willing do you think that MPs that independents would be to sort of work together, even though they may have ideological differences, to work together to actually make up a proper opposition?
I think there could be a voice which couldn't be silenced from the mainstream media if we could just get to any sort of critical mass. But we really need a fundamental change to the way our so-called democracy works, quite honestly. I mean, democracy is from the Greek. Demos is the people and kratos is the power to the people. Well, I don't think the people feel very empowered. I think they're in fear of their politicians mostly. And that's just not right. If I had my way, and we're a long way from having a majority of thinking this, but this will have to come from the people. We need to get rid of the House of Lords. They've done nothing to protect the public from from the various horrors that governments have inflicted upon them. The House of Lords is where they reward the toadies who toe the line and do what the parties want at the end of a compliant political career. That needs to go. I think we need to halve the number of MPs. We don't need 650. 325 is more than enough, and we need to ban them from ever having any outside interest while they're representing and holding those positions. And we need to move to a Swiss-style direct democracy model where all legislation is put to the public every 3 months, so 4 times a year, with referendums, and there has to be a public debate, and that then will be returning government to the people because they'll be the final arbiters on what laws are passed and what laws aren't. And I think when MPs realise that their decisions will be put to the people, I think we're going to get much more sensible legislation proposed, and the public, will, of course, will have a chance to veto it. And we can have things like a referendum on how many people we allow into the country every year, and I think the people would turn out and vote. And of course, the establishment hate referendums because they can't control them. We weren't supposed to leave the European Union back in 2016. We weren't supposed to vote for that, but it is the answer. The Swiss have been using this model for a very long time. They're considerably wealthier per person than we are, have a better economy, more income, and they haven't been involved in any wars for a great deal of time.
And in fact, it goes further than that, though, doesn't it? Because the Swiss are required to arm themselves, they're required to act in the nation's defence and so on, whereas we're busy trying to disarm everybody just for various reasons because of the bad behaviour of a few. So there's quite a lot to look to the Swiss for. Yes, let's just talk about health a little bit, because obviously one of the main topics of conversation that you have been pursuing over the last number of years has been excess mortality, vaccination, and so on. The MHRA is going through a transition of head at the moment. June Rain is retiring, and we don't actually know who's going to replace her at this point, despite the fact that the MHRA said that there would be a smooth transition and an early decision about who her replacement would be. They've cancelled her final board meeting, so there's not going to be an MHRA board meeting until September now. So the question is, what are your thoughts on the biosecurity and the health care infrastructure that we have in this country at the moment, and how much engagement are you getting from the public on this?
Well, the problem with the MHRA is that they're over 80% funded by the people they're trying to regulate. And I think it's very telling when June Rain said that they're moving from regulator to enabler. They've completely failed to protect the public interest and public health with regard to the novel COVID-19 so-called vaccines. That narrative is unraveling. I'm not surprised that many of them are looking to bail out. We've got regulatory capture, and if you follow the money, I mean, the World Economic Forum, in conjunction with the UK government, are funding something called the Regulators Pioneer Fund, which is funding huge amounts of money into all sorts of regulatory bodies in the UK. Things such as the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, the Civil Aviation Authority, I believe the GMC. And then this explains why any of their members who speak out with regard against the narrative, whether that's on net zero or the COVID-19 so-called vaccines and their safety and efficacy, they're absolutely hammered. We can't have a situation where those institutions tasked to protect the public interest are completely compromised. They're supposed to be independent. You lose that independence the moment you take money from vested interests, and they've all done it, as have obviously the mainstream media as well. And I mean, people can ask their own questions about individual politicians as well.
You were talking about the House of Lords a minute ago and the fact that it's not functioning as it should and so on. But actually, it's every institution, isn't it? Every institution is now full of vested interests, and none of them is functioning as they should. So, this is even if we could get some agreement on how they should function, it would be a massive task to sort this problem out.
Absolutely. The institutions in this country and around the world, not all the apples in the barrel are rotten, but all the apples at the top of all the barrels are rotten, and any apple that wishes to rise to the top has to rot. I'm afraid we need to take the top off all the barrels. Those who failed the public so badly must be held responsible. I mean, again, the week before Rishi Sunak called the snap election, we had a statement on the infected blood scandal, something that's been covered up for 4 decades. That report's 2,500 pages. I haven't read all of it, but when you find out that doctors deliberately infected young children with HIV and hepatitis merely to experiment on them without their knowledge, and one of the doctors was quoted as saying it's cheaper than using chimpanzees. I mean, my question to the minister, John Glenn, who was responding from the Cabinet Office, was, crimes have been committed. And it's a crime to cover up a crime, and it's clearly been a huge cover-up. When are the arrests going to start? And if that has to include current and former members of this House, then so be it. They're not very keen on that level of accountability. But until we get to that level of accountability, these things are going to keep continuing. And of course, I'm very sorry, but I mean, I believe that the COVID-19 vaccine scandal is going to be the biggest medical scandal in history. But unless we hold people to account, it's not going to be the last. And it must be.
So the question is, how do we hold people to account? And, you mentioned the blood scandal. There's obviously at the same time going on at the moment the inquiry into the post office scandal,
which I exposed 12 years ago. And 10 years ago in Hansard, you can read a full account, exactly what was in the ITV drama documentary last January. Nothing came of it.
Is it the case that actually we just have to wait? Because these inquiries are about events that took place a decade or 2 decades ago.
The public inquiry system was brought in, I think, in 2003 by Tony Blair. This is just a way of long grassing these issues.
Right.
Crimes have been committed. I've advised the sub-postmasters, and I was, unluckily for the government, my constituent was Mr. Michael Rudkin, the man who was accidentally shown by Fujitsu exactly what was going on and the manipulation of alteration of accounts remotely without the sub-postmaster's knowledge. He returned back from Fujitsu's headquarters. He was the representative of all the sub-postmasters in the UK. He'd passed running his sub-post office to his wife, Susan, in Ibstock, in my constituency. The next morning, after he'd been shown accidentally everything that was going on at Fujitsu's headquarters. The next morning, mysteriously, his wife had got a £44,000 shortfall on her computer and was charged with fraud. And he was completely discredited. That was from 2008. When I was elected in 2010, I picked up his case, and it took about 2.5 years to come with whistleblowers from Fujitsu to prove that everything Mr. Rudkin had said was true. None of the convictions against the sub-postmasters were safe because Fujitsu, on behalf of the post office, were altering accounts remotely, something which the post office had always stood up in court on oath and denied could ever happen. So all of those convictions were unsafe. I knew, the post office knew, the government knew, certainly by 2014, 2015, and yet it was dragged out for another 5 years in the courts at huge public expense, and justice delayed is justice denied. And now the government are trying to say that we're going to absolve all those who are convicted on Horizon evidence alone, which is unsafe, en masse through Parliament. And that will allow them to get the compensation they deserve. Well, I got Susan Rudkin's criminal conviction overturned in the first 9 sub-postmasters. That was back in December 2020. I can tell you now, I spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin only a few days ago. They still haven't had their compensation, and they're not waiting to have their criminal convictions overturned. The same will be with the infected blood. There's also another scandal that's been covered up for 30 years. That's the Gulf War syndrome of our troops. That was actually as a result of multiple anthrax jabs that they were given before they went out. That's been covered up for 33 years. And I was told by the Conservative Party through a proxy before I was expelled from the party that if I didn't shut it, they wanted to cover up the COVID-19 vaccine harms for 20 years. And why wouldn't they think they could do that? Because they've been so successful at covering up, and this is across the political spectrum of different governments. I mean, on the post office scandal, Tony Blair knew. He knew, he was told when he bought that Horizon system in for the post office, it was full of glitches. It was originally to deliver benefits through the post office. They'd spent £800 million on it, didn't want to write it off. It was full of glitches, couldn't make it work. And then they wrapped it up into a retail package and gave it to the post office as a Rolls-Royce system. Tony Blair has sat back and watched 1,000 people be wrongly convicted. And he could have stepped forward at any time in the last 20 years, and he hasn't done it. This is cross-party. This is what happens. The Uniparty is working to cover each other's backs. And the only loser is the British public.
You look at these regularly published indexes of corruption indexes around the world, and Britain is always in the light blue color, meaning it's absolutely no corruption here, nothing to see here. How do we have the wool pulled over our eyes quite so successfully? Why do we not see? Most people in the country do not see just how corrupt it is.
Because the mainstream media won't report on it. That is the problem. And I've advised the sub-postmasters, and I actually would advise anyone, these public inquiries will take years, if not decades, to come back and report. And they'll come back that no one's really to blame and lessons have been learnt. What we need is private criminal prosecutions. We have that ability in the UK. The government hate it. The establishment hate it. You don't need to go through the police. Crimes have been committed repeatedly, whether it's on the post office, the infected blood, the COVID-19 vaccines. What we need is charges being brought, and people then can answer those allegations, and that we need to get them in court as soon as possible. That's the only way we're going to get justice. But I can see the new Labour government, if they get in, one of the first things they're going to want to do is they're going to say, we've got big delays on the court system. I don't think they dare stop the private criminal prosecutions, but they can neutralise that by saying, we're going to suspend jury trials and just let judges make these decisions until we've got the backlog out the way, of course. A temporary measure. A bit like income tax was brought in as a temporary measure to pay for the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Yes, but I mean, the CPS can still take over a private prosecution and perhaps chuck it into the long grass. That's
just remind me, who used to run the CPS? Just remind me.
Who was it? Somebody begin with K.S. Yes, can't remember. Yeah. Yes, well, we only need to say the words Jimmy Savile, don't we?
We do. I think there were 6 victims came forward from Sussex Police at the same time, and the then head of the DPP said there wasn't insufficient evidence.
Yes. You mentioned Tony Blair. You've mentioned Tony Blair a number of times. Tony Blair brought in this inquiry system. I'm afraid you're going to have to remind me how it worked before that.
Well, you would have criminal charges.
Right. Okay.
Against people. That is what you do when you think people have committed crimes.
Tony Blair is responsible not only for taking us into illegal wars, but for the most egregious constitutional demolition job since 1998, and yet he seems to be untouchable. Surely the first head that needs to be taken into the courts is his, because if we could get him into court, and bearing in mind everybody views him as untouchable, that must have a chilling effect on people that want to be corrupt in other levels of government.
Absolutely, and you've got to remember, I cast my mind back to 1997 when Tony Blair got in with his landslide. And the first thing basically his government did, which was never flagged to the people in advance, was he took the death penalty out of the Treason Act, which came as a bit of a surprise. Why would he want to do that? Why is that a priority? And I think that tells you a lot about what's being done from that position of power, which has been abused. And of course, Tony Blair's touted to take over at the World Economic Forum from Klaus Schwab very shortly.
One of the things that we've been told about politics, particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, is that we shouldn't be personalizing it. It's quite amusing that we look at what government and NGOs are doing using Saul Alinsky techniques on the population. One of his key techniques was that you personalize everything. But when it comes to any opposition to what they're doing, we're not allowed to personalize it. We should be personalizing things a lot more.
Well, if you want the position, you have to take the responsibility. And the only way we're going to prevent people in positions of responsibility from abusing that power and not carrying out their duty of care to protect the public interest is if those who transgress face very, very severe sanctions. And also, when all this breaks, and it is going to break, there's going to be a huge increasing lack of public confidence, legitimate, in science, our health system, and the political system. The only way we're going to get that confidence back is if people know that those who've transgressed, and they've transgressed terribly, are going to be held to account. It's the only, and with very severe sanctions, very severe sanctions. And it's not just in this country. I mean, democracy has been usurped around the globe, and we've got a long way to get back. And quite rightly, there's going to be no public confidence.
Okay, so when the system breaks, and it is going to break, are you optimistic or pessimistic that there are enough people in the country that are right-minded and actually have an understanding of what has happened and what the causes of that breakage are to actually hold these people to account and fix the problem?
I think so. People are waking up fast. Most people know there's something seriously wrong and things aren't right, but some of them can't quite put their finger on it. And at the public meetings I'm addressing around my constituency and have been for a few months, people are coming and then they're realizing that they're actually self-censoring. They were scared to discuss these issues, even with their neighbours. And then when they see their neighbour in the room, then they suddenly realise, oh, I can talk to my neighbour about this. I mean, we're in the ludicrous situation where the intimidation to keep quiet about what you think's going on, lack of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, that even during an election campaign, I've got so many farmers that would have normally had boards up for me for this election. I've spoken to them. They all say they're going to support me still, but they feel too intimidated to put a board up with my name on it on their land. This is shocking.
It absolutely is shocking. Now, you've just mentioned something that's important, because lots of people in the last 3 or 4 years have found themselves in the situation where they've lost friends, they've lost contact with family because they've taken a position. I remember, in primary school being taught about the English Civil War and how it broke up families and broke up friendships and broke up communities. And really, we've seen the same type of thing happening to many people over the last couple of years. And it's staggering to me that in this time of maximum, we're in communication with people, with each other more than we've ever been, and yet we still see so many examples of people that have been completely isolated by what has happened to them. We need people to come together. How do we do that?
Well, we stand on the truth, and I think it was Winston Churchill said, you can deride it, you can ridicule it, you can criticize it, but ultimately there it is. And the truth is the truth. And Parliament doesn't want to face it. I actually have come to the conclusion over the last couple of years that the chamber of the House of Commons, which should be the first place to raise concerns, will be the last to admit to what's actually gone on. But on the streets, the vast majority of people now know sadly, people who've been injured or died through the experimental COVID-19 vaccines. And the government, sadly, can't hide the bodies. And that is just apparent. That's one of the reasons I've concentrated on that issue, is because it's undeniable. The science is all there for anyone who wishes to look, and it exposes the fallacy of our representative democracy for what it is. Members of Parliament run away from the chamber when I stand up because they can't debate the facts that I'm going to present to them. They just don't want to hear them. Well, there's huge appetite from the public, and some of those speeches I gave over the last 18 months in Parliament have had 30 odd million views on social media, 40 million views all around the world. There's a huge appetite for it, and it's not diminishing. So the tide is turning. And that's one of the reasons that so many MPs are running away at this election. The thought of being held to account, they think, Hancock's going, Sajid Javid's going, Zahawi, the vaccine minister's going. I hope they leave a forwarding address so we can find them, because we're going to need to.
Yes, they are trying very hard to hide the bodies, though, aren't they, by redefining what an excess death is?
Yeah, they rebased the population numbers for excess deaths mysteriously. When my debates on excess deaths started to build momentum, these excess deaths are happening across the countries who were heavily vaccinated. There was a paper I saw last year from the University of Western Norway Institute of Science and Technology, and I spoke to the professor who produced that paper, and the correlation is so tight between vaccine levels in 2021 and excess deaths in 2022 that he had actually done the calculation. It was for every 1% of your population that were vaccinated with the experimental vaccines in 2021, you'd have a corresponding 0.1% increase in mortality in 2022. And I asked him, when is this paper going to be peer reviewed? And he laughed at me and said, no one's will dare peer review this because they'd lose their funding from Big Pharma for peer reviewing it. He says, and the reason no one wants to peer review it is he said, no one can knock holes in our calculations. He said, they're 100% right. And that's the situation we're in. We've got capture of our regulators, of our educational institutions, and all of these are going to take a huge knock when the truth comes out. As will the mainstream media. They're just driving people away from them because people know they're not telling the news as it should be. They're not impartial. And that just makes them then, with falling viewer numbers, falling advertising revenues, or falling license fee payees, that they're more reliant on their other sources of income, which is government and Big Pharma. So they're stuck with what they've got. And quite honestly, I just can see mainstream media's going down with those who've perpetrated these crimes against humanity.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, we're more or less out of time, Andrew. But to finish off, you talked a little bit about this earlier, but let's just go into a little bit more detail. What do you actually need at this point from people? What kind of support can they give? And we want to support as many independents as possible. So we're really going to need people in all constituencies to help.
Absolutely. But anyone who wants to help, they can visit my website, which is www.abridgen.uk, and they can come and deliver some leaflets up in Northwest Leicestershire. You'd be very, very welcome. It is contact@abridgen.uk is the email address. You'd be very welcome. So there's plenty to do, and you get a warm welcome up here in Northwest Leicestershire from me and my team.
Brilliant. And it's only, what is it, 4 weeks, 3 weeks? How many?
3 weeks this Thursday until polling day.
Okay. And we need as many people to vote for independence as possible, even if the idea of voting is something which is an anathema.
Even if it's something they haven't done for a very, very long time. And I need a high turnout in Northwest Leicestershire. So you've got a real choice. You can vote for one of the mainstream parties if that's what you wish for, or you can vote for an independent who will work for you and represent you and your interests in Parliament.
Yes, okay, and distribute the idea of Independence Day. This is really important. So, Andrew, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today, and we wish you all the best for this. And hopefully we'll get a response, and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on. I'll go and get back to the campaign trail now.